for quite a number of years, there have been plans for Chaguanas to have a library. Now that the library has, been built, it looks very pretty and attractive, a nice new building in the heart of Chaguanas, and somebody next door, the law court saw it, and now it's been appropriated for the law courts. It's that kind of, where do we put our priorities as a society? Do we need more law courts, or do we need more libraries?
Dr. Rampersad, your focus from where you sit as chair, of course, would be education, literacy, social cohesion. Given the statement that you just made in terms of what exactly would be the focus, Budget 2014-2015, what are some of the recommendations that you would make or the Commission would make going into this fiscal year?
We see, and it's very distressing for members of the Commission, in our meetings we've expressed that, is the level of social disjunct. There is a lot of anxiety within the society, one. There is, I think, and I might have mentioned it to Paul at some point in time, a diminishing level of social happiness. And it's really one of my pet topics, because when we look in international developmental terms, there is a greater focus on that element, social happiness. In fact, I was in a panel with economist Ronald Ramkissoon in Rio Claro recently. They've been celebrating their 100th anniversary, and I was surprised that he brought up, this element of social happiness when you're factoring and talking about development, because in the context, Rio Claro is looking at its status as a village come town kind of thing in the context of national development. And national development plans tend to think, okay, we want to make every area a kind of capital, a kind of a city, a kind of urban center. Whereas how much is that the requirement and the need of the people who are living in the district? So those are, when you talk about research, those are some of the kinds of research we want to do. If you're talking about infrastructural development, your choice of building a highway or building a secondary road, for instance, for access, how does that fit into the development plan for the area? And I'll give Rio Claro as an example. Again, the government has identified in its planning process a number of growth pools for Trinidad and Tobago. And when you look at the map, I mean, both Ronald Ramkissoon and I, our heads kind of bounce on this, that there is no southwest development growth pole. All of that entire area, and in fact, most, if you cut the island in half down to the east and the west, very little in terms of identifying what the strengths are of these communities. And I say I could identify like hundreds of strengths of how we could work with the villages and the communities in identifying what their talents are, what their needs are. Agriculture, for instance, how do you build and develop that, and what kind of support systems are needed for that. Much of these lands in that area are state lands, for instance, which might be a good thing, because in a way it's protected the encroachment by business and development and that kind of thing. So do we have a plan in how much of that we want to preserve, what aspects of it we want to release for other kinds of development, or in tangent with development?
I'm glad you said that context. Let's talk about how we can change then the paradigm of approaching budgets, approaching expenditure, approaching investment in development in Trinidad and Tobago. From what we've seen has been a tradition of budget presentations over the last 50 or so years. And also added to that, how are we seeking to merge academia and the ground swell, as it were, or the voices on the ground in terms of these policy decisions that are made? Very often it is perceived to be top-down as opposed to bottom-up, or as opposed to highly consultative in terms of budgets in particular, and what we can do to get that academic voice involved based on the research and the people involved in those decision-making processes that don't seem like it's always on a macro level. It seems like there's a more consideration given to what is in the interest, as you indicated, the villages, the towns, because very often the urban centers like Port of Spain and San Fernando are always the points of focus.
Yeah, and you talk about academia, and I think in many ways too, the focus of our academia have been that kind of macro kind of perspective, which is passed on to the government and the decision makers, and much of the civil society voices haven't been taken into consideration in that process. Now I believe there have been a widening of that process, widening of the consultation and what have you, maybe not enough. But the whole issue about, when we talk about a democratic deficit, you talk about budget deficits, and the equivalent to that in terms of how a budget serves people, or how a government serves its people, is equivalent to what we call the democratic deficit in civil society circles. And for instance, our GDP in Trinidad and Tobago is what, $20,000 US, which means, and Andy Johnson and I have had this discussion before, every citizen is almost entitled to $20,000 US, right? A year. If for mine $20,000, I would like to see, okay, we want to have good roads. I don't want traffic. I want clean air, and those are things you can cut down into. Okay, so if the government is providing all of this, I am in a fairly well-off state. I'm happy with the governance system. But how happy are we, and how can we do that in that kind? How can we determine that in that kind of assessment? We have now growing in the cultural area, for instance, which has been very much underestimated, and we very well know that. Estimates of the contribution of the cultural industry sector to the economy, it usually gets the smallest chunk of the budget. We know it's very, very marginal. I mean, can hardly even support one of the basic sectors, what is given to culture in the budget. But in the current assessments, I think the latest figures I had was that for $1 invested in the cultural sector, it returns to the country, let's say $13. Vis-a-vis compared to oil, for $1 invest in the oil sector, you get back $5. So those are some of the realities we need to look at and readjust how we approach budget and budget planning and development planning.
How realistic do you think, Dr. Rampersad, given your statement on the cultural sector, the smaller communities, the focus not being in terms of making every town a borough or city per se, but in terms of development, sustainable development, how realistic do you think it is for us to put pressure on the government to place more focus on these aspects?
I think it's absolutely realistic, because when we look at the emerging economies, the new emerging economies of the world, China, Indonesia, those eastern countries, that's where their focus are on now. Their focus is on growing villages, using their traditional industries and their heritage industries, and capitalizing on that. And through UNESCO, I've been doing work across the region, in fact, working with at community level, bringing stakeholders together, with policymakers, it's tourism officials, it's the local tour operators, as well as the knowledge holders and community cultural practitioners together, where they develop their own local paradigms in terms of what their strengths are, identify what their talents are and what their needs are, and by that process build communities, not developing each of them into a city and into a town and with high rises and what have you, but what works for those districts. And we have quite a number of models across the region where this has been being done very, very successfully. Our problem, I think, in Trinidad, it's been both our bane and our boon, has been the oil sector. In a way, because it's allowed us a lot of money. I mean, it's put a lot of money into the hands of governments, into the hands of the community. But we need to assess, how much of that has really been filtering down, and where has been that filtering. For instance,
are we letting the private sector off the hook when we talk about developing the cultural industry sector and the entertainment sector? When you look at the Brazilian model or the American model, it's right next to, sometimes it's too much in plain sight. When you look at what Atlanta, New York, LA has been able to do with American culture and mass market it to the world, turning it into $1 billion industry. That was the American government.
Yes.
That was the American private sector.
Exactly. And I wasn't going to let the private sector off the hook at all, and you very well know that, so you kind of irking me on. Part of our culture, and I always get back to, unless we understand ourselves, we wouldn't understand how we address these problems. Part of our culture, and when we talk about the dependency syndrome, it isn't just about grassroots people who have really been resilient and struggling and striving and making do with their own. The poorest area is the one I just identified, that Southeast area, has the least crime, for instance, so there's no link between poverty and crime. The dependency syndrome has been largely perpetuated, I think, by the private sector. They've been cushioned with all kinds of incentives and subsidies and what have you, including the oil sector. And I keep saying one of in fact, the only statement I've been making for the last few years has been give to the culture sector the same kinds of incentives you give to the oil industry or the oil sector and those the natural gas sector. And you can see what can be done with it, right?
Now, I do believe that we have to take a break.
No, not yet. One more question.
All right. I'm looking at this dependency. It is an issue that we have here in Trinidad and Tobago, whether it is from the community level, from the poorest areas, or probably just based on history. Now, in terms of education and, of course, youth development, do you think that enough is being done, filtered through the government and perhaps through the private sector from where you sit?
I think the dependency thing is probably our biggest challenge because we've been nurtured on it. And I would make a most outlandish connection, the Constitution, right? We're talking about constitution reform, and we are 50 years after independence. Our constitution is very much a British kind of a system, inherited, brought down, wholesalely dropped on us, right? For 50 years we've been more than 50 years, I mean, but we have been evolving a society that's very, very different from British society, for which that constitution was made. And even in the current debate about constitution reform, we are still pinning and hinging ourselves on those two systems, the British constitutional system and the American presidential constitution system that is based on the British system. Whereas we have come from, yes, we British educated and what have you, but we also come from other systems. We have African Gayab system, the Indian Panchayat system.
But when you think of our value systems, how much are those systems valued in terms of reference points when the European aspect of it has been such a profound impact on our civilization, on our culture in Trinidad and Tobago?
On our education system.
Our education system.
But it isn't. If you and that when I talk about urban-rural divide, that's what I'm talking about. It's not the same in the country areas. You know, the value system's very, very different from what we are fed in the city, right? And what we are fed from the seat of government and from the decision-making portal of education and what have you. And some of those, when dependency, for instance, we have to talk about the university and that system itself being hinged on that British education system, when it could broaden and widen out its scope, its reach, and encourage that kind of different thinking and back to research that would give us that kind of thing. One of my basic the big research project I'm working on now is actually that kind of connection. The basic reality of Trinidad is that we are as much continental as we are an island. We are a big chunk. We are not a big chunk. We are a chunk of the South American continent that have been broken off, right? And we carry all that baggage historically. So the Mayan traditions, Inca traditions, all of those things are part of us. And I've been doing the investigations. I mean, some of the things that we think we inherited from Europe, Spanish traditions and all that, aren't at all. They go back way, way back to our Mayan traditions. So we have to recognize those strengths, and people come to you for that. That opens up a whole different field. DNA research you know, archaeological research. All those things we haven't been looking at in any
Dr.
kind of thing.
Rampersad, I just want to put a pin in it for a couple minutes because we do have headlines. Good morning, Trinidad and Tobago.